So good morning. June 9th on Tuesday, welcome again to our next series of online webinars from LSEC, broadcasting live this morning from out of Leuven. Yet another one in our series of cybersecurity innovation webinars that we started to do actually already a couple of weeks ago, while the outbreak of COVID-19 has happened and while we still were aiming to share some of the expertise with our experts together with you at home, and hopefully already today returned to the office. So today, a couple of days ago, a number of years ago, we actually remember one of the grandfathers of the cybersecurity space named Alan Turing, probably for most of you in the industry, very well known as one of the groundbreaking fathers of cracking the Enigma machine, but also foundation of the personal computer and the use of machines to process information. And to some actually also being seen as one of those who were the original ideas receivers of the concept of artificial intelligence. And combining a bit of those is really what we are aiming for today here as well. So in the cybersecurity webinars from LSEC, we try to give a bit of an understanding on where cybersecurity is evolving to, with some innovation based upon things like 5G, as we've talked about last week, but also in terms of things that are happening in the world of artificial intelligence, machine learning in that respect. So LSEC is a not-for-profit association founded about 2 decades ago. As of the University of Leuven, we bring together quite some expertise in the market, more than 465 IT security solutions providers, system integrators, but also research institutes are coming together and trying to cope with some of the challenges that we find in the market in terms of both cybersecurity itself, as well as data protection, as well as some of the industrial domains, for instance, in finance industry or in industry itself, manufacturing, that need to cope with cybersecurity challenges. So we try to do something with our different members to work towards the innovation in that respect. Earlier this year, while we still were able to get together, we've mentioned that one of the key trends, obviously, for 2020 is everything in relation to AI, different techniques that are being used, different technologies that are being developed, and also from an ethical point of view, we are considering what AI would actually mean. And also reversely, what cybersecurity measures that we need to put in place to make sure that AI actually really works. For instance, AI for robotics and law enforcement. Most of those systems that we are discovering today will be equipped with some form of automation of components whereby some machine learning or behavioral analytics has been integrated. Most of the modern systems will be looking for these things because it's actually way too complicated and expensive to continuously try to cope with all of the different threats and challenges out there just purely on a physical basis. Basically, we are not able even to do that anymore. So we need the robots to help us out. And that robot thinking has been also part of some of the prior sessions that we've had. We had one specifically with G-Data and Ralph talking about AI components being used into the domain of cybersecurity, but also from Alain for Fortinet, where AI technologies are being used in their current new technologies and products which are entering into the market. And last week, we were discovering how China Mobile is using 5G and also the way AI to actually automate part of the processes in that space. Now, of course, when we talk about AI, it needs to be fed by something, and usually that's data. And so we start with data coming from incidents, from the collection of instruments that we have into our networks, our endpoints. And so usually we found them to be collected into a platform which was called SIEM, Security Information and Incident and Event Management, which was basically the platform to look into and then to see how many incidents would be reported in there from the different systems that we would have. So many different indicators, indicators of compromise, exploits on vulnerabilities and so forth. And then we even needed to add to that some intelligence and technologies coming from the outside world, cyber intelligence, and mixing this with other available platforms. So all of these things have been elaborated quite heavily over the last couple of years, also by us. But I think what we need to do is as it's been written here by Sans, is moving from insights to foresight. So how can we actually consider that we need to get some more clarity on that space? And for those of you who are operating security operations center, who are monitoring what's happening on a day-to-day basis, will be probably familiar with this concept. And while we see more and more the SIEM evolving into maybe a combination of NDR and EDR, we thought it was definitely useful to discover a little bit what NDR specifically means and relate to it in today's session. And so also to understand better what we can expect from the EDRs and the NDRs. And while doing this, we also need to look into, of course, the data itself and how we can try to identify associations. And this is coming from an earlier discussion we've had with one of our activities, I think about a year ago, where some of the members of the Belgian CERT was indicating how difficult it actually is to relate all of the different activities happening in the field to this one single vector of threats. And so that's really what we'll be talking about, understanding most of these complexities from numbers of apps and numbers of APIs and security incidents. And so for this, we've invited today Stijn Rommens from VECTRA.ai. Some of you will probably know Stijn from his prior work. But today we're actually pleased that he was able to jump in on the very last moment as well, and talking a bit about NDR in this case. So we called it Stijn Machine Learning AI-based answer to SIEM. And Stijn, good morning. How are you doing? And now you are on mute. Yeah.
I was aware, so I was looking for the button. So good morning, Ulrich. I'm quite fine. I'm also looking forward to this. It's first time also for me really that I can talk about this in a webinar. I joined VECTRA about 4 weeks ago now, or close to 4 weeks ago. And like you said, potentially people may know me from the past. I've also spent time with Juniper Networks, Palo Alto Networks, Symantec most recently, where I focused primarily on cloud. And you could say it's going back a little bit to my roots, also going back to where I left Juniper Networks with IDP, and that's also where I met the current CEO of VECTRA, Hitesh Shet. He was, the time I was working with Juniper, he was the product manager over there. So that's where we know each other from.
Great, great. So I think that you probably have seen the world evolving as well very closely over the last couple of years, and moving from IDS and IPS into the world that we are today. So indulge us a bit with your views on what NDR can actually mean for us.
All right, I'll be glad to do that. And to kick it off, I'm definitely not Alan Turing, so I'm definitely not a mathematician. But what I would like to do is go over the current situation. What are the problem points we have seen, and what can we take away from this here going forward? So let me find the buttons to start sharing. And Ulrich, please let me know whether you see the things correctly.
Yes, confirmed.
All right, there we go. So I know that I will focus, and I hope we all know that we will focus here on the problem situation and what we can do about this. So, but one of the items we often see, and that's you could say the tagline I would like to take away from this first slide, is that we would like to find out ways on reducing the risk of a data breach. And often also the positive of that is positive outcome is that we can enhance the efficiency of our security operations and our SOC SOCs. So that's you could say the ultimate goal, which I will try to answer during the next 24, 25 slides. I think once we kick it off, this is probably very familiar to all of you, and I don't want to kind of abuse this to say, right, and there is a need to spend money on NDR, but at the same time, I think it's very important that we understand that not doing anything could cost us much more, right? The complexity of the attacks, what is happening within our network is only increasing. We do a lot of efforts, and I've been part of that effort in the last 20 plus years as well, where we have been looking a lot on preventive capabilities, where we have been implementing a lot of additional technology, but still we have a security gap. And I think even on top of that is that the dwell time, we call that, or the security gap in general, is sometimes only, or mostly is only increasing. We see more and more the gaps of over 100 days that an adversary can be present in your network before it has been detected. And once we now get the detections done, it's often also more costly. It's not just an initial infection typically anymore. We will see, because of the length people were there, the damage that they could have been preparing for is much higher. And also there's much more regulation to report of this. And this is probably also indicating why we, in the past years, have seen a few more of those breaches, or even the monetized impact, where the ransomwares, the malwares were there, have been in the news. And that's because of the reporting capability or requirements that companies have. So there is a huge need to look into this. And for that, what we also did is we worked together some time ago with cybersecurity insiders, and we did a survey together. And we were looking into what are organizations longing for, what do they believe is important. And I don't think this comes as a surprise that the majority of companies are looking into cybersecurity skills in general. So incident detection and response, that is where the majority of the need is, but also the detection of, for instance, abnormal system behaviors. And it's all related to the fact that the attacks are more frequently compromising organizations. And the only thing you can really do is try to reduce the impact, is be on top of it and take action as soon as possible. But the problem is that there is a lot of noise typically. You were referring, Uri, earlier on to the SIEMs, and it's exactly true that these have been, could say, the go-to point in the past years to kind of start hunting. But the amount of information that you actually receive in such tools is quite significant. And also often it is just, you could say, a report of a very small event that has happened, and there's not a lot of context coming with that. So if there is not a lot of engineering being done to build and to create the use cases around, for instance, operating such a SIEM, and as such also the procedures and the contacts, all of that together with the SOC people, then there is still a huge, you could say, a skill gap to address the threats that we see. Next to that, I think also when you look at the SOCs themselves, they see two major challenges. And again, not as a surprise, the detection of the advanced threats is becoming harder. Just pointed out with the SIEMs, we see the individual events. If there is no framework and use cases, playbooks built around these, it will be hard to find the unknown detections of the items. You pointed also out the IOCs. There is a lot of them, but that means also that there is time required to look into. And here we come actually to a very significant problem, is that the majority of the SOCs, being it internal in an organization or being it part of our managed service providers, is lacking skill. They have a huge problem to actually find the right people to operate such a SOC. And as such, what actually happens is, and I believe that most of you know what happens in a SOC. There is the tier 1s, the tier 2s, the tier 3s. So it's kind of tripling down. It's the first assessment, the triage that you need to do on tier 1, and that the majority of people actually is there in that tier 1 and is consuming lots of information there. So that means that at a certain point in time, the skill you really need to do the final investigation of an incident is lacking, because those people have been dwelling and been flooded by the tier 1. So that's where also the effectiveness of threat hunting goes down, because these threats will come back and come back and come back. So it's also a requirement to find the right skills, but there is a shortage, and all of us, I think, can agree on that. I pointed it out earlier already. We have done quite a lot of actions. We have been working with a lot of preventive capabilities. There is perimeter solutions, the next generation firewalls, the proxies are there. There's a lot or included or next to that best of breed integrations with anti-malware, antivirus, web filtering, reputation-based, as well as sandbox-based technologies. Even on the network itself, on the LAN, there is lots and lots of efforts being done to screen who is getting access. There is the NACs, there is the 802.1x, there's the radius integrations with such things. There's even the enhancements to find out, for instance, postures of systems and take a decision whether or not to allow them, not just based on who is working on them and whether or not it is a managed system, but maybe also is it still a clean or a well-operated system. So all of that is there, and still we see those attacks happening. And it is, you could say, a good colleague of mine once said, the attacks happen over allowed traffic, and that is just the reality. There is still the little pinholes of traffic that comes through. And again, from the survey, it is maybe shocking that we found out that the majority of respondents said that about 40% of security threats is being missed, despite the fact often that a SOC is there. And that is actually a very, very important topic to maybe pay a little bit of attention to, because why is it so hard to detect these threats? And it is because there is so many different indicators, and we have to actually validate all of these indicators that we get notified. But not every indicator that we get, of course, is a threat. First and above all, quite a lot of them is noise. We call that white noise, or just noise that is indeed maybe something that was accurate, but maybe not related to a threat. A lot of things could happen: miscommunication or misconfiguration, an error, a server crash. All of these could indicate that there is something wrong, and it is so. But that doesn't mean, again, that that is related to an incident. Also, when you look at all of the indicators, it could be 1,000 or even more, up to millions, depending on the size of your organizations, of incidents that you get in. So you can think about all the time that needs to be spent to review all of these. And then again, you have also those that are very easy to detect. If there is a website that is being defaced, right, that's a clear symptom. You can really take a good look at that and probably mitigate that. But there is also the small things that you often maybe not be able to see. Things like small configuration file changes. All of these could go actually without being seen. And this is where you really need to consider looking into AI, because that is the way you can start helping your tier 1 teams to get more effective, that they get help, assistance, you could say, in triaging the noise away from what is really mattering, so that the people that you still have can be augmented and get really better equipped to do that tier 2, tier 3. One of the remarks we often get is that the people within a company say, oh, we want to actually use our interface, and we would like to see, or the interface of a security tool, being it an NDR, being it, we want to use it because we know quite well who is working in our organization. Just by looking, for instance, at a name or looking at an IP address, I know it's a server from the terminal server farm, or it is one from help desk, or yes, that process being used there, it's linked with, that's all fine. But that means that you have to do a lot of work on that tier 1 again, that you could mitigate, because you can very well define what are the IP ranges of your VPN pool, thinking about remote work in those past months, or what are the help desk employees, or where are the backup service situated. So all of that is also part of enriching the context that you look at in your interface, so that you're not just looking at indicators and then have to figure it out all of yourself. And then we talk about AI, which is not yet the AI. The AI comes on top, which is going to find the context of the incidents and preferably related to the attack life cycle. We'll come back on that in a second. So all in all, what you now could think about is that when we really would like to optimize the SOC, there is a very huge demand. Our customers of SOCs, or the customers themselves, what they demand from a SOC is rapid identification and remediation of these attacks. And that is quite clear. As we said earlier on, there is a good reason why we want to find them quickly, because if we do it, we have the time to mitigate. If not, and they will stay undetected, it could be a huge devastating effect on a lot of things. Not only the cost to figure out what was wrong, but also the reputation of the company. So you could say there is, in my opinion, 3 options we have left, or 3 choices you could say, and that is to hire a lot of people and to equip your SOC. But keep in mind that due to, again, size of your company, but also due to the amount of events that you'll have to vet out, you probably need about 10 analysts. And that is not a given, right? Just finding 10, that's not going to be easy. Finding 10 really good ones is probably going to be a big problem. Secondly, you could also say, right, I do have a couple of good guys. Rather than having them spend lots of time on triaging in tier 1, let's actually look for good tools, for instance, augmented with AI, so that the tier 1 can be done by new hires or junior staff or even students. We have organizations that are leveraging NDR tools with AI to kind of have the students, the job students, like we call it here in Belgium, to actually vet through the tier 1s, and so that the original staff can be trained, can be equipped to do the tier 2, tier 3. They know the network very well. They can quickly those events that seem serious vet out. Or thirdly, you could say, let's give up. I don't think that's really a choice you have. So I guess what we need to focus on is the second choice, that is to use the AI together with the skill that we had with the original team to figure this out. And then why is there still a gap? So there has been a lot of technology, and I've personally been involved with quite a few of this. And there is good reasons why they were evolving and why they existed, but there's also quite a couple of indications why they're lacking today had to be effective. And when we look at the IDS or the IPS space, it was really, you could say, developed to stop exploits on the wire. It was an alternative back in the days to anti-malware and antivirus on the desktops, right? Still, you could say we're there today. We're there with NDR, with EDR, but that's an evolved situation. The other problem of the IDS and the IPS is that they were often built on signatures, right? So you really, really needed to know what has happened. So a security investigator or security research was required to find out exactly what was the modus operandi, and you could write a signature to find it out. And as such, the consequences, you cannot detect what is unknown, right? Also, you also have to write a signature, which is the consequence, when you know about it, but the time is critical then. It's probably been passed, and there is no way to really go back because the packet has passed the wire. Then you had technologies like NetFlow, very well when you needed the network monitoring tools or the performance monitoring of your networks. And that was exactly where NetFlow was built for. It was to validate how well the network was operating. It was telling you sources, destinations. Maybe it gave you a little bit on the entire tuple, 5 tuple, the protocols as well. But it was kind of like a phone registry or a phone bill, where you knew who had communicated with whom, but there was no indication whatsoever what was the conversation about. So there was no real indication what could have gone wrong, for instance. And then you have other tools. The network forensics, they are typically also known like the rolling PCAPs. They store a lot of data, and there's a lot of good data there, but there's so much data that you often, going back also to the time constraints we have, do not have the time to go through all of that information. And then finally, and I think that's where also why it is over the horizontal bar, that was the SIEM. That was a good approach where a lot of network and endpoint information was pushed into it. Firewalls, proxies, DNS, endpoint, maybe up to Active Directory information was there. And it gave you often a lot of good information about north-south traffic within your organization. But it was definitely still lacking a lot of your east-west traffic. And when you think about the attack lifecycle, that is again where the lateral movements will happen. So there was still challenges. We had to combine a lot of these solutions together. We had to build a lot of correlation rules, that was the magic word with the SIEM, and still there was so many blind spots, and we still were missing the facts. Even with the SIEMs, there was a lot of the attacks that were dwelling around for over 100 days. And that was actually pinpointing where the need is. So this is also where Ulrich was referring to. Here is where we really need to move into that SOC triad, where the SIEM is still a very important component of the infrastructure and the setup in a SOC, but it needs to be augmented with, for instance, EDR and especially also an NDR, because the NDR will give you the views of what is really happening within your network. And for that, you really need to collect the data at the right spots. We'll discuss about that. And you need to make it rich. You need to add flavor, you could say, to it. A good cook and a good chef will have a lot of ingredients that will be added to the raw materials to consume and to eat the dish to make it nice. So when we look at where we need to go to, I think it's that security needs to evolve also with the network, right? Not just technology, but it needs to be able to be hybrid, right? We are moving more and more into cloud, and cloud, for me, it's a swear word, but there is so many things there, of course. There's IaaS, there is SaaS, there is the VPNs, there is the web, there is the email. It's all cloud, you could say, right? So you need to be able to have at least a view into that, and you need to balance visibility with efficiency, right? So you need to kind of ensure that what you present to an analyst is going to be matters. It's something that matters. It's of high value, high fidelity. And then also you need to make sure that you do understand not just malware tactics, but you also can understand what is the thinking, behavior, for instance, of an attacker in your network. How can he find out his way? Keep in mind that there is not that many options he has once he is in the network, right? So there is a couple of things that we can fall back on. And we need to ensure that what we present is not too much, right? That we can still handle all of this. And I think this is where the journey of an NDR starts, because you'll have now to go through a couple of phases. It's make sure that you collect the right footprint of data, and preferably something we do without agents. There is not a lot of organizations that are happy and are jumping around of joy to install yet another agent on a server and or the desktop's laptop. So that's one of the things. Collect the right data, preferably do it as clean as possible, and then put on your secret sauce. And that secret sauce is to enhance that PCAP, or whatever you could call it, the net flow from the days in the past, and make sure that you add richness there. Talk and think about what is mattering. How can an analyst take a good decision looking at this data? Come back to that on what it exactly is, and then make sure that that secret sauce plus the original raw data is delivered in a packet, in a format that you can consume, that is flexible. You can put it into either your own processes or consume the processes offered by your NDR vendor. And so when we look at the first one, as said, is you need to capture the information. And for that, you need to be able to put that, for instance, at the core of your network. Look at the span port of your core switch, preferably, so that you can see the inside to outside traffic, that you can see inside to inside. And with inside to inside, I mean preferably the critical hosts talking to critical hosts, internal hosts talking to the data center, and the data center plus, as I pointed out, the internal network out. What is important, what you hear from me is there's no interest whatsoever for an NDR to look at what is coming in. What is, for instance, that exe file? Do we need to look for any indicator there? I guess, and I hope we all can agree that that has been addressed by the preventive capabilities that we should have deployed. So what this capability is going to focus on, as we pointed out earlier in red, is on what we have allowed in the network. So we'll need now to apply more information on the allowed traffic. And that is exactly what is happening here. That is enriching the data. And here is maybe the first time we really can talk about what is machine learning, what is AI in the context of NDR. And I try to, you could say, really compare this with what we know from the past. So if we would look at security research, that is what we did from day one with IDS IPS. We were looking into the signature or into the data. We were trying to analyze it backwards to understand exactly what had happened so that we could create a signature to detect that. And that was a lot of the research that was going into it. It was kind of isolating individual events, but it was time consuming, and it was not taking a lot of context into account. If you then would say, right, we'll not talk about security research, but we'll go and talk about data science on itself, then you could also all end up in a pure mathematical model. And that is going to create additional noise on what you already received within your SIEM, because these type of solutions are purely anomaly based. So they will try to find out what is the baseline within your network, and then they will apply mathematical models to understand this is a deviation away. and from the baseline. But remember what we were talking about: human errors, configuration errors, crashes, but also a lot of things like new users leaving, new devices, new ways of working. What about a tool that was just looking in the fact that suddenly only new IP addresses were appearing? Think about now with COVID-19 that all of those VPN IP pools were increasing in volume and maybe they were not even covered. So what about all of the mathematical models that were having to be redone? So we have to think about the combination of these things. So we'll have to enhance the mathematical models with security research. And that will hopefully result in different types of questions and answers we can give. We can now talk about, okay, we have seen a host, but was this a privileged host, right? If it is a privileged host, maybe we need to pay better attention. Or is this part of a larger infrastructure? Or is this part of a larger engagement? Maybe there is a campaign going on. Remember that attackers typically will make sure there is multiple stations they can work from. So are these somehow connected? So look at the bigger picture. Or for instance, is access done to privileged assets? Or what is the host ID? Often we talk about the IP addresses, but IP addresses can change, right? Especially again, if we go from office to office, we come from remote, we might even go on terminal server. So what about that? Make sure we can articulate, you could say, a host concept within your NDR without having to find out what the IP address is. So of course, it's important to know what was the last IP address related to an incident, but also what was the host. So enrich that information, look into other tools like EDR, look into tools like DHCP, even event logs on Kerberos that you also can mount it or map it with the accounts. And then we come back on what was the privilege of the account. What is, for instance, the beaconing, the way out, the tunnel, that the command and control tunnels, for instance, are they using unusual JA3 parts within the certificate? So all of that is what you can now answer by enabling security research that knows about what could go wrong with the data science that could automate the correlation of this. And then, as I said, what you need to do is make sure that all of that information you could collect can be used, can be consumed, either through tools that we can offer. For instance, in this case, that's where you have an interface detect where you can really look into the event, the chain of events, where it is mapping it back to the attack lifecycle. There's a small example coming on later. Or you sometimes also need the use cases of the threat hunters, where you really need to find out, because of IOCs and potential new threat research, you find out that there might be an indication that you need to find it out. Is it existing in our network? And finally, you would probably want to optimize the investment you have done. If you are investing already in a data lake, being it one of those SIEM vendors, but also we know about customers using the ELK Elastic Stack, the ELK Stack, or other tools to consume and to bridge all of the different technologies they have together. That needs to be your choice, so that you can then define on what do I want to achieve. Am I hunting? Am I looking for compliance? Am I doing incident response? Can I go back? All of that also with the third-party integration. So an ecosystem of leveraging your NDR enriched data is important. So if we go back now to our SOC capabilities, the critical SOC capabilities we identified earlier on, I could start maybe with this, kind of referenced it already a little bit, is the use cases of threat investigation, threat hunting, compliance. And what we offer is an option here to build a lot of these with the help of hunters, threat hunters that have helped you already to define these use cases. And think about maybe just the threat investigation use case. Organizations easily can see, for instance, 100,000 spam emails a day. And I'm not by accident using 100,000 because I'm going to do some correlation here. And as I'm not Alan Turing, I need to do it easily. So for instance, you have email gateways that are performing spam analysis, and they're effective in 99 or even more than 99%, but let's say 99%. So that means that about 1% of that email is still coming through. On 100,000, that is still 1,000 emails, right? Even if you then think that from those 1,000 users or emails, only 1% of your users clicks on, for instance, the spam email links in there. The spear, this is not even a spear phishing attack, and this is more of a broad generic attack. Even if only 1% does it, it's still 10 emails, right? So who is going to look into all of this? Who is going to investigate? Where is that user going to? What was sent over HTTP? Was there something breached? Was the domain that they connected to really suspicious or not? Were credentials stolen or not? So there is such a huge requirement here to look through that you come back to what we talked about earlier. Tier 1 will be overwhelmed. Another example, for instance, with the threat hunters, if you find out about new attack vectors, there's new IOCs that are present. How are you going to hunt for that if you even have the time already, right? So you need to be, you could say, proactive, not only reactive, but also proactive. And then finally, you learn about things that the WannaCry and others have been exploiting, for instance, Eternal Blue exploit. So how can we figure out that will not happen to us? Can we figure out quickly whether or not there is SMB v1 still used within our network, or do we still have weak ciphers within our internal network? What versions do we have of TLS? Do we have open RDP ports? All of this is something you need to be capable of doing as well. And as such, we have been building those use cases, threat investigation, threat hunting, compliance available as well. And that is not just something that VECTRA is building, but that is something that traditionally SOCs will be looking at as well. And so when I now look a little bit further down the road, this is where the real bread and butter of AI comes with, because this is not something that is based on signatures. Here you really have, and that's why it is colored, of course, look at the attack behavior. You have to think about what can an attacker do. There's not a lot of things. He has to kind of repeat a lot of things, right? He has to take a methodology, and he actually has to take multiple steps to achieve his goal. And in the past, you could say defenders of a castle, if they made one mistake, and they were taken over by the attackers. I think here we are entering a different model here. We are, you could say, the ones that can make a mistake and maybe miss one indicator. It's now the attacker that cannot make a single mistake, because there's multiple steps he has to go through. And if we now can catch him, we have multiple options to catch him. That's where we talk about the attack lifecycle, or the attack kill chain. And so here we can look at command and control and reconnaissance, for instance. These are the types of detections, the models we create, and we have a lot of, as I said, data scientists, but security researchers together that build these. And a lot of the command and control and reconnaissance is a supervised model. And what is a supervised model? It is that you have a lot of access to data. And here, for instance, relationships we have with Microsoft come to a very huge advantage, because there is petabytes of data that we could analyze to find out what it is to, for instance, see misbehavior of SMB traffic or RDP or RPC, or just how can we work with Kerberos tickets, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of things we can do there. And then you still, of course, need the unsupervised models as well. That is typically more of what you can see at the right-hand side. And why is that? Because we never can know what exactly exists in your network, right? What are the types of endpoints? What are the types of users? What are the types of services? Is there different LANs? How do they connect to each other? That is where you kind of have the learning phase. So you could say the first end is applicable at once, because that is quite well known. The second set of intelligence or machine learning takes baselines as well. That's more of the mathematical approach, but you cannot really depend just on the mathematical approach. And when we then apply all of these models on where the traffic could pass in our network, we come back to what I was talking about earlier, right? So what are the sweet spots to inspect traffic? And here you see clearly there is no interest whatsoever in what is outside or north of the firewall. But what we are interested in is, for instance, also the traffic internally in the LAN. And of course, it might be impossible to have every access layer switch connected with a sensor, span port or tap. But minimally, I would say the core switches need to be there, as well as those access switches that have high value resources and assets connected. Okay, that's why you put the sensors. If you have the VMwares, make sure they're there as well. If you have the AWSs or other tools, make sure there is information there as well. And so here you have a clear indication of what levels in your network we can detect that, and make sure all of these sensors bring it together into one brain, one analysis component that you can leverage to find the indicators as well as the ongoing phases. And of course, typically make sure that that is connected with your SIEM or data lake of choice as well. But this gives you a really good indication, I would say, what to focus on and where to go to. And here we're back. Right now, we have identified what are the different use cases we need to power our security and need to be powered by security enrichments that are being used by our SOCs. And this is where it all starts from, right? It's what we can connect and collect from the network. So the virtual, physical sensors, cloud sensors, they will collect information. And rather than just putting PCAPs, like the forensic tools we talked about earlier on, we need to make sure we enrich this. So there's metadata created of these. And the metadata will give us the information about the protocols being used, etc., where it was going to, what was happening, could say, on the protocol level. And then, oops, of course, we need to go down. I think the artificial intelligence or the machine learning comes to play. It is now, where can we augment the value of that? I pointed it out earlier already. An IP address is nice, but if you have multiple IP addresses, let's make sure we can bring it back to that host ID. Maybe also a lot of companies are focusing a lot on the assigned privileges to administrators or system admin or system accounts, system admin accounts, or backup operators, etc. But that is, of course, what you have assigned. That doesn't mean that you, at that time, have a good understanding how they use that privilege in the network. And if you think about it, that's exactly where the adversaries are after, right? They try to compromise a system. And from that system, they find out, either, for instance, by using tools to read memory and understand maybe what are the local administrators. And then they can start dwelling around and taking the next steps. Try to connect to hosts within the same network. You won't see that on the firewalls. Therefore, you need to collect the data, preferably on the switches. And we have too many organizations that have been using, for instance, the same system admin, local system admin account on every system again, because they were building it into the golden image. Deploy thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s of systems. And if you can collect just that system admin account, you can connect to any of the systems. So this is where you need to look at the observed privileges of an account. Are they using that privilege from a strange system right now, a system they never used it before, connecting to, for instance, a service they were not connecting to from that host, especially not with that high privilege observed credential. So this is really where the artificial intelligence will come to help you, because we not just talk about a fact or a given that comes from your privileged access account management tools, but it comes from the observed accounts. And then I think we need to take the advantage of the complexity that our adversaries have to go through, right? There is two types of attacks we all know, right? We have the opportunistic threats, where typically it's the monetization, the botnets, or the ransomwares. That's quite a lot of standard things, right? The command and control it's used there is once the WannaCrys of this world, the ransomwares, or you know where the kill switches are. You might kill the contact or the access to the kill switch. But therefore, you need to understand really what is command and control as well, in order to still find the infected hosts that are talking out, and hopefully you're identifying them in time. But then you have the more advanced or targeted threats. And as I said before, the attacker does not have a lot of different ways to walk around within the network. He will have to do his reconnaissance, right? He can start on the desktop. That's true. And there the NDR will not see a lot. But that's again why in a SOC visibility triad, you will use your EDR together with your SIEM and your NDR. And here your EDR might understand some of the indicators and maybe lock it down already. But still, there's ways that you use legitimate services on that desktop, which you cannot kill, even not with EDR. So as of that time, the internal reconnaissance has revealed what are the open ports on the host, but maybe also what are the accounts being used there. And then you can start connecting with those allowed protocols laterally within your network. And then you can start to find out the next hop. And maybe you can find an admin host, a server, or I must say a desktop typically used by the administrator. Maybe there you can find in memory an admin account, so you can find a higher privilege and you can escalate your privileges. And then from there, you can find your way to the Active Directories or the file servers, maybe even move it into the cloud. And that is exactly the lateral movement components. You still have to make sure that the infected hosts, most likely multiple ones, are being able to be controlled. So they will have to connect out. There is command and controls, the remote access tools they will be using. There is always multiple. And then before they can do the damage, either acquire the data hide, you could say, data, maybe even exfiltrate the data. There's a lot of steps that needs to be taken. And this is exactly the approach that we want to talk about. You need to talk about the risk-based approach. There is intentionally things we will not alert on. That is exactly to avoid too many incidents coming in front of the SOC analysts. That might not make a lot of sense on its own. But if you now can start thinking about building this out and looking at the risk-based approach, where you say, right, if there's a few low types of events going on, okay, we'll put them into the lower left quadrant. Or if we start to see some evolving, right, you see at the right-hand side some colors there. That's the different phases of the attack cycle. When you would look at the screen and an attack would build out, you really would see the dots moving up from left up to high and then to the right into the critical quadrant. And this is exactly what is important. Make sure that the analysts can focus first on the critical incidents, and then from there make their way down into the high, the medium, and if there is time left, into the low. And make sure all of this is correlated, so you find out about the different steps. And an attacker, remember, is only able now to make or should not make any mistakes anymore. We have a few more opportunities to find them. So if I come to a couple of conclusions, I think it's important that we talk about that SOC triad again. So this is also what Gartner is talking about, and NDR on itself will not solve it. SIEM on itself will not solve it. EDR on itself will not solve it. So you really need to take a holistic view, either within your own SOC or the SOC that you select from your managed service provider. Make sure that they also see what is happening within your network, that they can take the indicators as well on the different phases of an attack. And then make sure that whatever solution you select for is part of an ecosystem, that you can really leverage the different phases you require within a SOC operation. That means that you can connect it into a SIEM because you need, for instance, to do your investigation. You want to validate a couple of things. You probably have written quite some playbooks already there that you would like to leverage still. At the same time, you also want to make sure that you can detect this on your own local infrastructure as well as in cloud and hypervisor type of infrastructures. Make sure that you also, if there is no span ports available, can leverage a TAP infrastructure to collect the data. Make sure that you have, once you find something, response capabilities or enforcement capabilities, that you can go through existing workflows, or that you can, for instance, leverage integrations with, I just name a few in this case, CrowdStrike's, Carbon Black's, but also Microsoft, to take an action to, for instance, isolate a host. Or what we have done very, very often is on the NAC side, because we learn about a host, the threats going on there, the severity or the certainty, you could say, that is something happening there. That's two factors that build that quadrant. You can give those values into your NAC or into your radio server, so that once the system connects again based on the MAC address that we saw, you can say, right, okay, we deny access as soon as the threat level of that host has been over 50%. So enhance your existing infrastructure with the insights of the NDR. And then I wanted to also take the opportunity, because some time ago we had Bartas Not here as well, who was talking about the Microsoft ecosystem there. We will, and this is a real, you could say, sneak preview. Later today, we will announce a huge partnership also with Microsoft, where we are making sure, and I think it's probably the only EDR there, that can work together with also the Defender ATP out of the interface of the NDR. So it gives you two things, that integration with an EDR. It gives you enrichment of what is happening on the host, what names, for instance, that host has, but also what is running on it, what OSs, etc. But it also can be used then to do the response and the enforce actions. And secondly, we now also, I think, are the first ones to in-depth support Sentinel, Azure Sentinel, also as the cloud SIEM to put a lot of information in there. And you can read it yourself as well, that Microsoft is very pleased with this integration. By the way, they're a customer of the VECTRA solution as well, but it's the ecosystem that for us is important. And then my final conclusion here is that I said in the beginning, we want to strive for a couple of things. So that is to reduce the risk for a breach, but also we strive for enhancing the security operations. And I think this is giving you a good example on the volume of messages that you get, or incidents that you can get in, that you have to triage through. And then effectively what you really need to pay attention to. And that is the goal of a tool like NDR, where you apply machine learning and artificial intelligence, is to reduce the workload on at least your tier 1 staff so much that you can focus a lot on the tier 2 and the tier 3 investigations as well. With that, I thank you for your time and your interest. And Ulrich, handing it over to you again.
Well, thank you very much, Stijn. That was a very comprehensive, very complete overview of why and what is needed today. So I think, yeah, there's many different questions, of course, and I think one of the most important question here is for those companies that are looking towards security solutions, and you gave the overview there of the different integrations that you have. It's quite a lot. So I'd say probably not all companies out there have this massive budget that they can start purchasing all of the different solutions and actually come up with something which maybe even their SOC team can still not handle. So two questions therefore. Number one is, what is the basic set of solutions that any company in this case would need to have when they would like to go and further cybersecure themselves? So let's say beyond the traditional firewall, to take it even from that low level, what is it that they would need? Do they need to go directly for a full NDR type of solution, or what's type of the granularity that you would recommend those companies to have? Now, I think you gave a pretty good view on why on-prem and also the cloud combination, but still there's quite a couple of fragments to go to. So I'll hand it over back to you.
Yeah, thank you. I was hoping that we indeed could take the time here, because multiple questions is hard to answer, of course. But I think it indeed is important to look at the layered security approach, right? Like you point out, you should not forget about the basics, and the basics are mandatory, right? We're not going to talk about the fact you should abandon your firewall, or you should not have antivirus on your systems, or you should not deploy MAC IP spoofing on your switches. I think that is important. You also heard me talk about the fact that we consciously do not do, for instance, this type of analysis, because it is a pre-taken situation that you should have done that before, and that you actually come into a situation where allowed traffic needs to be inspected, right? I think that's important. Does that mean there's a lot of money to be spent? I think it's money you have to spend, right? You have to put your perimeter, your endpoint protection, your LAN protection to a certain extent. Next to that, typically the question comes on, do we need to build out a complete SOC, or should we go with, for instance, a service? I think that's the next step. Or, and I think this is really where we have an alternative now, is for those companies that are building up their matureness, there is an option to start with the NDR without having to start with the SIEM. And so the NDR tool itself is actually seeing all the traffic, right? It is seeing the traffic east-west. It's seeing most of the outbound traffic, could see traffic in the virtual environment, and as such, it could bring it together. And you have an interface that is going to present only high fidelity logs, or incidents, so that the few security staff you have can really work with that almost out of the gate. There's you could say, a short, steep learning curve, but once you've gone through, you could say that 1 to 2 months of getting to know the tool, getting to know your estate, it is going to give you maybe a few minutes a day work of reviewing, because you can also make sure the triage is done kind of automatically. You do not have to redo that every time again. And this way you can start working from that practice of the NDR. Over time, when the matureness is growing, your skill set is growing, you have the right people within your organization, you can start thinking about adding more. Then, for instance, the SIEM can come back, or you can start looking into the data lake, or you can start looking into the integrations. Because indeed, I pointed out a few on the slides of integrations with different brands that there is, but there is also a lot of coding you can do yourself. For instance, one that was not there is Aruba ClearPass. It's very, very easy to write a script, not to just, for instance, send an update to Aruba ClearPass in this case, which is the most obvious one, of course, enriching that tool with security information of the hosts. But at the same time, for instance, even if you use an antivirus solution that was not in here, you can use scripts to learn information from that system within the NDR as well. So you could take a little bit of the steps of a SIEM. And probably our friends at the SIEM level is not going to like what I'm talking about right now, but often we even can help companies reduce costs on their SIEMs, because typically they are licensed on events per second. And if you reduce the volume of events you send there and replace that with high fidelity information, you actually can optimize quite of the cost there as well. So I hope that answers your question, Ulrich.
Yep, it at least answers part of it indeed. So the other component was if you would have already a SOC as a service in place, is this still something that you would then need to consider on-prem? So while companies might start to look for maybe outsourcing some of their SOC activities and still operate their own network, so then you have the external advisory basically watching over the logs and the networks. And so then you expect this to happen probably from the SOC as a service. Is that still, yeah.
Yeah, for sure, that's an option, right? I'm definitely not saying that you need to build this yourself. I was saying that you can look into a SOC practice as well, maybe managed or not. But the point is here that even if you currently already have a SOC, being it in your own building or with a managed service, you still need to add that flavor of network insights, right? That those sensors still need to be there, and they can fed that information within your managed service. That's also why we are working with the leading managed service providers in this world to augment even their operations, right? They suffer the same problems. They suffer the same shortage in skill, the same shortage in people, and as such, also the knowledge on how to deal with advanced threats. So I think both ways go.
One of the things that we talked about yesterday was the impact, of course, of the machine learning, behavioral analytics, the impact of AI. You mentioned it here a couple of times as well. So I'd say, what are the specifics of the solution that would be required for such a platform? So what would be the actual basis for an AI platform of today? And how would you see that further evolving with maybe other types of AI techniques?
Yeah, I think what is important is very important. Very much is the combination of security research with automation. So you cannot just tell a system, here is mathematical models to look for a deviation from a baseline, because that is going to result, you could say, in the same situation we were before with the SIEM, where a lot of incidents were coming in. And again, I'm not downplaying the importance of a SIEM. I'm just pointing out the challenges we have with the overload of information, and the results we also get from our customers say we are really not getting through all of this. The alert fatigue, we call that, is present. And as such, I think the machine learning is augmenting the security work. So I think more research needs to be done together with the models, the mathematical models, to reduce the noise. I think that is the essence here. As I said, I'm not a mathematician, so I'm not going to be able to talk about the very specific models being used there, but I think it's the correlation of the things. I think one of the best examples we spoke about, and maybe let's put a name on it, is what we call the trio components, where we look for user accounts in combination with the host they work on to where they go. And Ulrich, if you log in the morning on your desktop and you authenticate to your Active Directory, that is a very normal way of doing, right? But if you would, for instance, also then log in with your admin account or your system backup account onto that system, that's definitely, for instance, not a good practice. You should not do that there. For that, you should use JumpStation. So we can bring that to the picture of the customers, like, right, maybe best practice is to do it there on a JumpStation. And to bring it also back to, if that backup account is used on another desktop, never used before, and then connecting to a file service, that's a weird combination, right? And that is where you can automatically combine that. That's where the machine learning can help. But it's the security team that has to identify that this is probably not the right way to do it. This is probably the way that an attacker would try to do the reconnaissance within a network. And that is where the security research meets the mathematicians. That's, I think, where a lot of the focus needs to go on. The other point also is that I think a lot of companies still need the guidance on how to approach an incident response or a threat response capability, right? I think a lot of the times we forget to define what are our severities, what are our priorities, who are the people to work with, right? Coming back on your previous question, when you have even a managed service, how often is the practice really well defined between the organization and the managed service provider? If there is a real hot incident ongoing, do they exactly know who to talk to within the organization? Maybe the network operator is another partner, right? Do they have contacts there? Can they take action, right? What are the mean times between detection and taking action? And can they do they have the authority? That's a lot of questions that often are forgotten, and that people just look at the NDR, the machine learning, and the AI. These are tools, right? What we also have to build is the practice around it.
Yeah, so I think that then the next question is, and then I'll leave you to it. What's the next big thing? So we came from the one, there's now the triads. What happens after the triads? Should we expect something else?
I think that the triad is definitely the framework for the future, where you bring in endpoint network and the correlation. But I think what is next is that even NDRs will have to look at the hybrids, right? If we were talking about the VPN IP ranges that we see now more often with COVID-19 that you need to look into, this will only increase, I believe, right? I think a lot of companies have understood that there is also a good within remote work. And I think even if we looked at the news last night, that Somers is even saying that going forward for the Flemish government or the Flemish organizations, probably it will be the default to do remote. So that means also that we'll have to evolve in different platforms, right? We'll have to consider also more services. There will be different data feeds that you need to consume, right? When you're in cloud, in SaaS, there is no way you can deploy a sensor, right? You'll need to take in different sets of information. Maybe when you go into even being at private data centers, also again, they're maybe not easily to deploy sensors. So what are the different types of information? Also, one of the things we have started to work on and is already there, but it's looking not just at hosts, but also accounts, because when you look at the attack factors you see in cloud, it's not compromising typically the host, it's compromising the accounts being used to log in, and preferably not those that log in into the service, but log in into the administration, the API side of the house. So I think that is where a lot of the work in the next, you could say up till 12 months will happen in enriching not just network, but also your cloud network through different sources of information.
Yeah, and as you rightfully put, also indeed privileged accounts So things going beyond just the network and the endpoint traffic then in this case.
Exactly.
All right. Excellent. Thank you very much again for sharing this with us and for being here this early morning with coffee and other goodies. So let me quickly share my screen again and to just point out a couple of the other activities that we have planned for most of the rest of the day. So after this, we'll continue at noon with another session, which is specifically focused on a challenge within the industrial cybersecurity that is being faced, and that is to understand where your assets are, discovery of those assets together with Landsweeper. So it's definitely not only for industrial and manufacturing environments, it's equally so the case for administrative environments. So first, of course, you have to know which of the activities that you have, which of the assets that you have running on your network or in the cloud for that matter, and trying to understand before you can actually start to secure them and start monitoring them. But that is for later today at noon. And then for the rest of the week, so tomorrow we'll focus towards our TRIF activities. Within TRIF, we focus on digital transformation for manufacturing. And then we'll have some of the use cases from out of the Netherlands, world-class maintenance, best practice from the field lab of Campione there, and thanks to world-class maintenance for doing this. And then on Thursday, we'll be talking a little bit about things such as the necessity for identity and access, which is again taking up to be a very strong component of the day-to-day infrastructure when it comes to cybersecurity. And so in this case, it will be with Wouter from Accent Rex on how to govern identity and access control in these domains. So with this, I'd say thank you very much again for joining. And for those of you who are doing this in replay, I wish you all a very nice continuation of the day, and hope to see you again later on today or in one of our next seminars and webinars. Thank you very much again, you too, Stijn, for being here, and hope to see you soon again, live and safe in the next coming weeks, maybe even in the next days or so with a beer.
Oh, bye. That would be appreciated. Thank you. Take care.
See you later. Bye-bye.